Sure, many of you have had products at home that came with warnings on them, and many of you have thought to yourself, well, that's a bit unnecessary, isn't it? Like there's a baby stroller that said, remove child before folding. It seems like common sense to me. On the Apple website, it actually says, do not eat the iPod Shuffle. Again, I don't know why they need to say this. On a rotary tool, it says, this product is not intended for the use as a dental drill. 1, go to a dentist if you want dentist work done. 2, I wouldn't want one of those things in my mouth. I saw a picture of one, and I'm like, I don't think I want anyone approaching me with that thing. 1 says, do not allow children to play in this product. The product was a dishwasher. Seems like common sense. Another said, warning, this product moves when used. The product was a scooter. It's kind of why you buy the scooter, isn't it? Another one said, may irritate eyes. The product was pepper spray. Again. Another one said, safety goggles recommended. This product was a letter opener. Again, I'm wondering why these warnings exactly were needed, but unfortunately they were probably needed because all of these things probably happened at one time or another, and to avoid being sued, they had to put this warning on there because someone had done it. Sometimes we do need to be warned, though, don't we? We need to be warned of things coming. Sometimes we just miss the signs of God that He's trying to put before us, and so we need someone to actually come and warn us of the coming danger. We need something to blatantly spell it out for us, and that's why God sent the prophets in this time of the Old Testament. He sent the prophets because the signs were there, God's word was there, telling them exactly what to do, but for some reason, they missed it. And so God had to make it clear exactly what was going to happen. He had to make it clear exactly what He wanted from them, so He sent prophets to give warnings. To give warnings to the nation of Israel and to the nation of Judah, to tell them, I expect better of you. To tell them, if you continue down this road, this is what will happen. And we can see from the very get-go, when Israel divided, that the kings were often wicked kings. It started with Jeroboam in the north, where it says that he didn't want the people to go down to Jerusalem to worship because he was afraid of losing the people, and he was afraid that it might mean the end of his life. And so what did he do? He created idols for them to worship. He created idols. He ignored the signs in Scripture. He ignored the warnings that were given and instead did his own thing. And with each generation, the idols and the evil and the corruption and the lack of godliness increased with each generation. Until we get to our story today and we see a king who was the best at something, but the problem was the best that he was best at was doing wrong in the right of the eyes of the Lord. So let's look in our Bibles at 1 Kings 16, 29 through 31, where we pick up in our story today. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than all of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. Not only was King Ahab the worst of the worst when it comes to king, but he married someone that whenever we say that person's name, it means an evil woman. When you call a woman a Jezebel, you know exactly what you're referring to because she summed up exactly what that meant. This was the original Jezebel, and this was a problem. She was a pagan of pagans and wanted to worship Baal and none other. Now Baal was the god of weather, and Jezebel worshipped him so much that he actually had all the prophets of the true God killed, except for one, Elijah, who fled and was taken care of by God, because there was a bigger purpose in Elijah's life. We pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, and there it says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Why would God do this? Why would God refuse to send rain? He did it to show that He was the one true God, to show that He is the God that has control over everything. You see, the story is all about the glory of God. The story is all about the glory of God. Whether it's the upper story, the lower story, your story, or my story, the story is all about the glory of God. And that's the core of what this all is. And idolatry is an affront to God, an affront to His glory. And idolatry is if not the core problem of the Old Testament. Over and over again in the Old Testament, it seems like the nation of Israel is turning back to idolatry. In fact, we have a little prayer group that meets on Saturdays, and one of the things that we were talking about in it is that it seems like over the last few weeks, all of the stories are kind of the same in the story. And they all are different, but they all kind of revolve around this core issue of quit worshiping other gods. Just stop. Why do you keep on going back when you see all these bad things tend to happen? And I think it's often we kind of wonder, how could you ignore such signs? How could you ignore such warnings of what's happened to your life? Yet, whenever we talk about this, we often gloss over the issue. We often don't think of idolatry as something that's a problem today. We don't think of ourselves as having idols. But I want to say that possibly, just possibly, our hearts really haven't changed that much. Possibly, our hearts really haven't changed that much, and maybe, just maybe, our idols aren't graven images made out of metal and wood, but maybe they just look a little different. Maybe our idols are a little different, and so they're easier to overlook because we don't have them up on a hill, carved out of wood, standing above everything. Yet, they're still idols. Sometimes we need to ask our question of, where do we put our hope? Ask the question, what holds the seat of glory in your heart? And when you answer those things, you answer what you worship. You answer what it is that is your God. Now, it's either the God or an idol, but it is your God. Sometimes we take the view of entertainment because we want to cope with life, and we don't turn to God, yet we turn to entertainment to distract. Sometimes we look for someone that we love to complete us, whenever the only thing that can truly complete us is God. It's not a spouse, it's not a loved one, it's not a friend. Sometimes we look for money or finances or possessions to satisfy, yet the only thing that can truly satisfy is the living water that comes from God. It's not money. Sometimes we look to our identity and say, well, it's the job that I do. Yet the only identity we truly have is follower of God, Christian. That is our identity. You see, an idol is anything other than God that takes the passion, value, hope, glory, or commitment of your life. There's only one thing that should be consumed by those things, and that is the true God. If there's anything else that comes into play, then it is counterfeit. It's a counterfeit God, and it is crept into your heart, and it may not be an idol right in front of you, but because of that, it's sometimes even easier to overlook because it's not tangible. It's abstract, and it makes it harder for us to see. A little survey here. How many of you as adults still enjoy kids' cereal occasionally? Okay. In fact, I have stopped eating cereal because my wife got tired of me always eating such sugary junk food cereal, and I have to agree that's not good for my health. So I've just stopped eating cereal because I really don't like the healthy adult cereal. It's not any good. And yet we don't let our kids have the kids' sugary cereal, so I was the only one in the house eating it. And so we decided just to stop getting it and stop buying it. Now, when I was a kid, I loved sugary cereal, and my parents bought sugary cereal for us. But my dad was, we'll say, frugal, to put it nicely. And he was frugal, and so he bought the generic cereal. Now, there are some things that I buy generic of and some things that I don't. It just kind of depends on what it is. And sometimes you can't really tell the difference. It works just as well. But I don't know if you've ever had some of the generic cereals, and some of them just aren't quite the same. They taste a little off, and to be honest, you kind of get used to them, and they're not horrible, but let's just be honest, they're not the same. They don't fulfill you as much as a nice sugary cereal. And even though you do get used to them, whenever I would go to church camp and they had the little boxes of real cereal, I would get reminded of what real cereal tastes like. Or I'd go over to a friend's home that didn't have such frugal parents, and I would have real cereal, and they're like, man, this is what I'm missing. And yet I would go home and just get the generic cereal over and over again. Well, sometimes we kind of get used to these generic gods. We get used to these imitation, counterfeit gods that just aren't the same. And every once in a while we get reminded of what the true God is, yet we continue to go home to the generic gods. We continue to go home to the gods that we were maybe raised with. We continue to go home to the gods that don't cost as much because they don't impact our life quite as much. And we know that the real God is better, but it's also a lot harder to get. It costs more of you. More is expected of you. And so we continue to worship the generic gods. And because of that, just like in Israel, a drought is coming. When you worship the generic gods, eventually there is no water left for you. Eventually the drought is there, and you can turn to your generic gods, but they won't be there for you. Only the true God will. And if you spent all of your time focusing on the so-called gods, then how can we expect the real God to bless you? You see, Baal was the god of weather, like I said, and especially rain. And so what did God do? God sent a drought. Not even any dew. And he did this to show that Baal had nothing on him. He was a counterfeit god. He didn't matter in the least. It was only him that was the true God. And so when we look at our own lives, we shouldn't be surprised when there's a drought in an area where we serve a false idol, where we serve a false god, and we wonder why God isn't blessing us in that area of our life. And yet we look at it and we say, well, it's obvious, isn't it? In this area of my life, I'm not worshiping the true God. So why in the world would God bless me? Why in the world would God bless his competition for your heart? Why would God bless that? Now, we also shouldn't be surprised when the opposite holds true. Whenever you give God your life, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, blessings tend to happen. We shouldn't be surprised about that. And not that this happens with everyone or has happened in everyone's life, but I have met people that decided that they were just going to live for God and never worry about getting married. And lo and behold, what happened? They met their spouse. I've seen people that decided to finally give even though they didn't think they had enough money to tithe, and lo and behold, all of a sudden they had more money than they realized what they had. Now, this doesn't happen 100% of the time, but I do think that God is more likely to bless you in an area when you've decided that that area is going to be wholly belong to Him. And we can't expect blessings when we're not giving it over to God. Looking in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 19 through 21, it says this: Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet on Mount Carmel. This is Elijah talking. And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all of Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said this: How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow Him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Why did the people say nothing? The people said nothing because they wanted to follow both God and the idols. They wanted the both of both worlds, best of both worlds. Yet God doesn't share. God doesn't share our heart. It's all or nothing. It's either Him or the idols. There is no middle ground. You can't pick or choose what you believe. You either have to follow Him wholly or you don't follow Him. That is the only in between. And we pick up the story in verse 25 of 18, and it says, Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it. First, since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is God. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is asleep and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until blood flowed. Now this might seem a little ridiculous to us today. Might seem a little ridiculous that they would cut themselves. It kind of seems a little primitive or even barbaric that they would bleed for their God in such a way. But when we really think it, are we any different? Often we bleed and even sacrifice everything for our generic gods. We think that it costs less, but it really doesn't. We get addicted, whether it's drugs or alcohol or whatever it is, and we lose jobs and relationships. We make excuses that it was their fault, not mine. But it was your addictions to whatever you had that did it. You let lust and sex rule your life, and soon your marriage falls apart. You let entertainment be your idol, and before long you realize that you haven't really spent any quality time with your children for days, if not weeks, if months, because it was more important to you watch the game or your television show or whatever it was than actually spending time with your kids. And so your relationship with them is sacrificed. We bleed for our gods. We bleed for them, which is not physical blood. In 1 Kings 18, 31 through 37, it says this. It says, Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar to the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 sheaves of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, Fill 4 jars with water and pour it over onto the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, The prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Notice here that this is not for Elijah's sake, but it's for God's glory. Elijah is wanting people to know that it is God's glory that will reign that day. Not Elijah's glory, not the glory of Baal, not anyone else's glory, but it is God's glory. Picking up in 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice. The wood, the stones, and the soil also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Once again, the story is all about God's glory. You see, idolatry doesn't just offend God, it hurts Him. And it hurts Him because He loves us too deeply for it not to be hurting. You see, the Bible says that God is jealous for us. He doesn't want to share us. He's jealous for us. And when we give our hearts over to another God, it hurts. In fact, it's like that we're having an affair on God when we give our hearts to other gods. We're having an affair, we're cheating on Him. And He is the jealous husband that wants to get his wife back because He loves her so much. He can't stand to see her with somebody who's not going to be as good for them as He is, because He wants what's best. In the story today, we had Hosea was one of the prophets we talked about. And Hosea's life was an object lesson. Hosea's life was a lesson of God and God's people. And that's what it was all about. You see, God told Hosea to go and buy a prostitute. He told him to go and buy a prostitute and marry said prostitute named Gomer. And He let Hosea know it wasn't going to be easy. And in fact, throughout Hosea's life, if you read the names of his children, you'll see how not easy it was, because they were named for things like, this child is not mine, and things like that, because he knew what was going on. And eventually, Gomer left Hosea and went back into prostitution full time. And Hosea seemed to just want it to be that way and just wanted to wash his hands of it. Yet God told him to go buy her back. Buy her back. And so he did. Took her back into his home and continued to love her as his wife. Why did God have Hosea do this? He had Hosea to do this to teach Hosea and the nation of Israel a lesson about love. You see, we are the prostitute. We are the one continually cheating on God with other idols, and yet God is sitting there ready to buy us back from said idols. To buy us back and take us back to love us once again. Because His love for us is that great. And so, why does God continue to send prophets? Why does God continue to give us warnings? It's because He loves us too much to see us with generic idols. Let us pray.